Picture your team being able to map out the external attack surface as it grows and see the same attack vectors as a hacker does. Most tools out there do asset discovery, but stop there. Enter Detectify. It takes an inventory of exposed web assets and automates vulnerability testing for security misconfigurations, expiring subdomains, and risks in third-party software. Here's the cool part. They crowdsource payloads from leading ethical hackers. It finds bugs you actually want to fix and finds them in time. Start a free 2-week trial by visiting securityweekly.com/Detectify. Go hack yourself.
Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover in one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guest and completing the form. We review suggestions on a regular basis and will reach out to you once reviewed. All right, for our second interview today, we are interviewing Will Clark, who brings us stories about architecture and security from the trenches. From some interesting roles. Previously, Will was a security architect at GE. Now he's at Accela, and who makes software for local governments, and is now in a general architecture role, so not security specific anymore, which I find a bit fascinating. Just the idea of being in security and leaving security. I didn't realize that was allowed. Welcome to the show, Will.
Thank you. Thanks, Adrian. Good to be here.
Yeah, so they let you out. They let you leave security.
They did. At GE, it got pretty tight. I was locked in, but that phase ended. And when I moved to Accela, I had a great opportunity to be in a more general architecture role. It's a much smaller company, much, much smaller. Most companies are smaller than GE, but nonetheless, Accela is a solid, mid-sized company, and there was a good general architecture role there. So I took it.
Okay, so it wasn't something where security had you running away as fast as you could go. It just happened to be a role that you were interested in that wasn't security related.
Yeah, well, to be honest, when I started at GE, I was a director of software, so I was managing several teams. And then there was a great opportunity in the security team to sort of become that liaison between the application teams and the security team in sort of a security architect specific role. So I took that and really learned a ton. It was an amazing 3 years of time spent there. And then, like I said, when I moved to Accela, the opportunity was better on the general architecture side. So that's where it started.
Yeah, and interested to hear, now that you're in a non-security role, I'm sure you're still dealing with security, in some respect. I think just about everybody these days has to. But interested to hear how that's changed for you in this new role.
Yeah, great question. So in the previous role, I spent a lot more time working with the compliance team and dealing with some of the, DAST and SAST. I set up, I heard Ricard talking about it earlier, and I have to echo his thoughts about how useful DAST can be, or not useful, but one way or another, I spent a lot of time working on those pieces. And in this role, it's really much more, the security team, they have a security architect who focuses on that. And so I work with the development teams more to set future architecture direction, and of course, try and incorporate good security all the time. But, at some point, I think a lot of most of the developers understand for new code, we want to prevent XSS and all the other top 10 OWASP, top 15. It's more about how do we, for Accela especially, it's a 20-plus-year-old software company, and it was built up sort of piece by piece by a bunch of different teams. And so getting to grips with all the old code that's around, and how do we remediate it in the most efficient possible way, given the small size of the engineering org, is one of our big challenges. So to me, that's been a big change. Is not so much, I don't worry so much about, that there is a vulnerability in an old library of code, but how can we plan to update it, and how can we move to a microservices-based architecture without it taking 3 years.
So you moved from a company that provided industrial products to a company that serves the government. I believe I've got a quote from our prep call where you said something along the lines, "What moves even slower than industrial? Government." So
Yeah.
how do you cope with that? Because that's something, I started out working for financial services firms, and they're I guess somewhere above those. They're not terribly slow, but still, how do you cope with that, and how big of a change has that been moving from G to there? How long does it take to move the needle on some of these things? Especially architecture, right?
Yep. Yeah, there's a couple different factors involved. One of them was at GE, we were a software engineering org, mostly building new software for existing industrial assets. So it was mostly about monitoring all those industrial assets, jet engines, wind turbines, gas turbines, things like that. But it was mostly new software. So that didn't take as long to get to grips with. At Accela, it's that history of legacy code that's been a big challenge. And in terms of how we get to grips with the pace, well, it really depends on the situation. Log4j, for example, that got everyone's attention. We moved really fast to get that patched, and we still have a lot of customers with on-premise installations. So we put together a package, the weekend before Christmas, the holidays, to get that out to them with documentation. People were working throughout the night to get that done. So in some cases, it moves really fast when there's addressing a 10 out of 10 vulnerability. But in other cases, it's, there may be an old library, and sometimes the library is so old that while there are CVEs out against it, the chances of someone trying to exploit one of those, or it could be that the way it's implemented within the code doesn't provide a lot of risk surface exposure. So it really depends on the particular area, I think, in terms of how they move quick or not move quick. Honestly, one of the biggest challenges, other than the ones I mentioned, is the proliferation of older versions. And even if we have more than 50% of our customers into our cloud environment now, there are still plenty on-prem, and a lot of those have older versions that have been customized to their particular situation. And local governments typically don't have the biggest ID departments. I mean, witness the malware explosion everywhere. So helping them update their code, update their package to newer code is one of the bigger challenges. It's just a matter of getting that done when it matters.
Yeah. I think you have some interesting stories, around some deployments you've done. I think one had to do with building a centralized token management service.
Yeah. So in the past, when Accela started, there was separate authentication all over the place. I mean, initially, when I joined, right before I joined, there were several separate data centers. Each one had their own authentication. Now we've moved to a single data center for the US. Our international customers have their own, but nonetheless, there's still some separate authentication services. So one of our big projects for the next couple of years is to consolidate all the different auth into one place, so we can essentially have Accela internal SSO for customers. That's been so. Actually, in terms of timing, that was one of the things we wanted to get out around this time, but it got delayed by other priorities. Customers were really asking for one particular feature, and product decided that needed to be prioritized higher. We didn't have an outstanding security concern that we could easily, we didn't have a risk that was there that was causing the escalation of that auth token service. So it got pushed down the order a little bit. And that's a typical use case. I mean, we have a lot of things that, especially from an architecture perspective, I wanted to do to get us more modern and just be closer to the state of the art. But again, customers always have the first priority. So, and the dollars speak. And nonetheless, I mean, it's not a complaint. It's just how life works.
Yeah. Yeah, and I suppose an advantage of being in an organization where things do move a little bit slower is you do have, for addressing tech debt and things like that, you've got some time to put some processes into place and to make those a habit, versus an organization where somebody's constantly downloading new stuff, trying out new JavaScript frameworks, constantly launching new cloud infrastructure. Does that make it a little bit easier? How do you make sure that like if you leave, how do you make sure that things are, the processes you put in place are going to stick, I guess I should say.
Yeah, great question. I think there's a couple different ones there. First, does it make it easier? I'd say it doesn't necessarily make it easier overall. It just shifts the area of focus from what's hard. So rather than having to deal with the latest tech all the time, that's not a problem that we really need to deal with too much. It shifts the focus more to, given the small team, given the huge backlog of software that needs to be updated within Excella. There's a bunch of different products there. Some of them are not being maintained anymore, but customers are still using it. It shifts the focus to, where do we prioritize to really help the most people and provide the best optionality for Excella going forward. I think that's one of that to me is one of the hardest problems, is just, where do we put our focus? There's so many different options. It's like, how do you find that optimum place to do it? And just one other thing about, government software, it's not like Amazon, where people all over the world are shopping 24/7. It's mostly US based, and it's mostly 9 to 5 or 8 to 5, East Coast to West Coast. So our evenings are pretty low in traffic, and that one of the things we're looking to do this year is be able to dynamically scale to reduce our footprint in the cloud.
Yeah. And then, go ahead, Katie.
I was just going to ask, as the world has changed over the last couple of years, and as we're entering yet another phase, and this whole great resignation is upon us and being talked about in the media, how is that impacting I know you said that customers are definitely requesting certain products, certain features, but how is that impacting how you're approaching your own development and how you're approaching meeting market demand?
I think we saw at the beginning of COVID that governments, first everything, like everybody, everything shut down. Nobody knew what was going on. So that was scary, because everyone was afraid of less revenue and nothing happening. But moving beyond that, we've seen that with greater emphasis on less physical presence, we've seen that the demand for Excella software has gone up, because customers don't want to walk into City Hall or walk into whatever government structure is required to perform their, permit renewal or whatever it happens to be. So I think that's about the closest I can get in terms of the Great Resignation. There's other challenges we face as a company that I think all companies face, just in terms of inflation, labor costs, all of that has been skyrocketing the last couple of years. But aside from that, I think the specific part is there's been more of a demand for digital government interaction. And that's definitely a plus.
Sure. And it seems to me, as with other industries too, this is just forcing modernization more quickly. But has that been a little bit of a bigger pressure on you and Excella, given that government is a little slower to adopt, versus, the tech industry or the financial services industry in some cases? Has that put more pressure on the company to get up to speed quicker, or, how does that impact how you're deploying things, how you're maybe sunsetting things, how you're meeting not only market demand, but some of the compliance mandates that are put upon you, both, locally as well as federally?
Right. Yeah. Great question, especially about the compliance mandates. That's the one I can probably speak to the best. The others, in terms of, demand, increased demand for speed, I think probably our product team is better suited to discuss that. I've seen it's been mostly good from that perspective, but on the compliance side of things, we have definitely seen over the last 2 years a big uptick in demand from our customers, the state and local governments, for various compliance forms. one large customer is the one that's really driven a lot of it, including a SOC audit and a few other things. But it's not just them. There's a bunch now that are asking for state ramp. That's come to the fore as a subset of FedRAMP, that collection of NIST 853 controls. So we've seen some customers start asking for state ramp. And so we're exploring that and looking into how we can meet that. And it's a challenge. I mean, it definitely is, especially on some of the process documentation side. Getting our code up to speed is going to take time too, but we've seen state ramp come to the fore.
Yeah, honestly, that's brand new to me. I've heard of FedRAMP, but hadn't heard of state ramp. Is it kind of like a copy paste of that, or does each state have their own?
Well, the idea was that each state used to have their own, and so compliance with, 49 states or 50 states became a real pain in the butt and very difficult to accomplish. But because of that diversity of requirements, a group that I forget who's leading it right now, what collection, but a 3 years ago, they started state ramp as a subset of FedRAMP. It's not as strict. It's pretty close, but it's not quite as strict. And so the idea is to consolidate all those controls into one, tier that companies like ours can use and they can give the stamp to, and then states won't have to request as much of an audit when they're doing some of their procedures.
And kind of on that same topic, how hard, obviously last year we saw the cybersecurity executive order, we saw a ton of new legislation, and most of the stuff that's come down is mostly on contractors, folks that work with the government. So I'm curious how much of that stuff has left you kind of scrambling, like especially the executive order.
Yeah, good question. That honestly has not been a big factor. We don't have a lot of real sensitive data. When I was at GE, the contractor, we did achieve FedRAMP, and the contractor situation, actually it was more than FedRAMP. There were nuclear sites there. And so this is GE again. There were nuclear sites, and so it was all limited to US persons. And that became a huge problem for us because we had a large group of green card and offshore developers. And so getting support for that in that situation became really tough. A lot of the managers who typically weren't on pager duty had to get on pager duty to respond for the FedRAMP data center. But in any case, at Accela, I haven't seen it be a big issue so far. I mean, we have other security challenges that we're dealing with and going through, just mostly in terms of some cloud cleanup type stuff, but not related to that executive order so much.
And I imagine security requirements vary quite a bit from customer to customer, even though they're all government, but some are federal, some are state, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't think we may have a few federal, but it's almost entirely state and county and city.
Okay.
So chances are there's a decent chance that if you go to your city and look up how to get a building permit or a license to do this or that, you might end up at Accela software. But that's the public-facing software, the community software. The software that most of the software that we sell is what called back office. It's what the employees of the cities, states, counties, what they use to record all this and manage it.
Right.
And send out inspectors. Inspector running an iPad, maybe running the Accela iPad app, so they can go through their rounds over the course of the day and determine what's good, what's bad, et cetera.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to add? Any other interesting anecdotes or discoveries you've made recently?
Yeah, I think just one thing I'd like to emphasize that I've learned, going back and forth between security and general development / architecture. Well, there are a couple of things. One, evaluating risk is such a complex thing. When I was in security, if something had a high CVSS score, it's like, all right, it has to be done. But when you have some empathy coming from the engineering side, it's easy to appreciate, or easier to appreciate how much work it's going to take and how much risk there really is. Like when you look in the code, how exposed is this based on all the other mitigating factors? So I think that just as a general perspective. And then one, I think, fun Accela anecdote is Cal Cannabis is one of our customers. They're the California Cannabis Regulation Organization. So just being involved with that process. I'm not going to say there's any more or less security from them relative to other customers, but just being involved in that process has been interesting to just have that cannabis factor in the job now.
Yeah, brand new. I know nothing about those regulations, but it's all going to be fairly new, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I didn't before, but it is new, and I think it's only a matter of time before pretty much every state in the union has a department like this. So hopefully they all buy the Excel module for Cal Cannabis or for cannabis regulation.
All right. Well, you heard it here. Excel is the place to go. When those states finally come over to it, or maybe at the federal level. I think where Tyler and I live, we'll probably be one of the last to legalize it. If it'll probably be federal before Tennessee or North Carolina would ever legalize. But what's that, Tyler?
Oh, I just said you're right. Absolutely not anytime soon.
Yeah. All right, Will, thanks so much for joining us on Enterprise Security Weekly today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thanks. Pleasure to be here. Appreciate it, Adrian.
We'll be right back in a few moments with the weekly Enterprise News.